A novel about Darth Plagueis by James Luceno was originally scheduled to be released in October of 2008. Luceno has said that his early ideas for the novel was that it was going to be a first-person narrative, wherein Sidious discovered a holocron narrated by his master after he murdered him, and that Luceno had taken a lot of inspiration from specifically Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. And the main thrust of the novel was going to be Plagueis and Qui-Gon Jinn separately searching for the answer to immortality. But by 2007, the novel had been put on the back burner due to concerns about how it would fit with revelations about Palpatine's backstory and other prequel era stuff. Reading between the lines, Lucas Books and Del Rey was probably worried that revelations coming in the Clone Wars animated show would contradict whatever Luceno had already come up with. So its place on the release calendar was taken by the second Darth Bane novel, which the Darth Bane trilogy was not originally intended to be a trilogy. The only reason it became one was because the first book was so successful, and Luceno went on to write the Millennium Falcon novel instead. But he was still interested in telling the story of Darth Plagueis, and by 2010, it was announced again that Darth Plagueis was finally going to be released in 2012. Darth Plagueis ultimately made it to number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list for the week of January 29th, 2012, and was ultimately on the list for 2 weeks. So way back in 2012, I was pretty selective about what Star Wars books I was reading because I had a lot going on in my life and I just couldn't commit as much time as I used to reading every single Star Wars release as it was released. And I wasn't super interested in the prequels era, so it's not until now, 10 years later, that I'm finally reading Darth Plagueis for the first time. So, a brief summary. Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious, Sith Master and Acolyte, target the galaxy for domination and the Jedi Order for annihilation. But will Sidious's desire to rule supreme and Plagueis's dream to live forever sow the seeds of their own destruction? So Darth Plagueis is bookended by a prologue and an epilogue, which depicts Palpatine around the time of the events of the Phantom Menace. As the story opens, he has just killed his own master, which Luceno then segues into 3 different parts. Part 1, Enlistment, is set 60-some years before the Battle of Yavin and details Plagueis killing his own master, Darth Tenebris, Plagueis killing another one of his master's apprentices, and then tracking down some possible Sith trainees that the Biths had been keeping track on, and then finally meeting Palpatine and making Palpatine his own apprentice. And then part 2, Apprentice to Power, is set about 10 years later, so 50-some years before the Battle of Yavin, and deals with Palpatine's beginning rise to political power, the maneuverings that Plagueis and Palpatine carry out to make Palpatine the new senator from Naboo, as well as some schemes that sort of bite Plagueis in the butt and don't come out well for him at all. And then part 3, Mastery, picks up 30-some years before the Battle of Yavin and is basically the lead up into the Phantom Menace. So we see a lot of the things that happened in those pre-TPM novels like Cloak of Deception and Darth Maul Shadowhunter. And as the book ends with the death of Maul, Palpatine is once again the sole Sith. But he's met Anakin Skywalker and he has plans for the future. So perhaps as befits a novel written by James Luceno, who is famous for his encyclopedic knowledge of Star Wars, Darth Plagueis is a very dense read. there are references out the wazoo, and some references are pretty obscure to the point that I would not recommend reading this book in its chronological order, because I think it works better if you have knowledge of a lot of the things that are being mentioned here. If you've read Cloak of Deception and Darth Maul Saboteur and Darth Maul Shadowhunter, and so you can understand and appreciate what Luceno is referencing here. But at the same time, some of the references go beyond just basic knowledge of the books that preceded it and are, yeah, pretty obscure. As the story opens with Plagueis killing his master, Luceno says, "This world will have a role to play in the Clone Wars." And I was like, I don't remember this world at all. And so it took, yes, looking it up on Wikipedia to discover that it had appeared in one of the episodes of the 2D animated Clone Wars show that ran from 2003 to 2005. So I think definitely your mileage may vary here. If you're the kind of Star Wars fan who loves references, especially when they're obscure and you have to do a lot of digging to find out about them, you will probably really enjoy Darth Plagueis. On Goodreads, reviewer Crystal Starlight described Darth Plagueis as being the Star Wars equivalent of a historical novel, and I think she's dead on. But sort of, to explain what I mean, I'm going to have to detail my hierarchy of historical novels. So I would say that at the bottom, we have what I would call historical fantasy, and I think the best example of this is probably the Bridgerton TV show on Netflix, where it is not historically accurate, but that's the point, that's the appeal. Especially in historical romances, you get to take the trappings of history, the pretty dresses, the opulent sets, the balls, and all of that, but you get to insert modern ways of thinking so that you can have that happy ending where a duke marries a serving girl and everyone's fine with it. And that's not to say that historical fantasy is the worst of historical novels, it's more that that is almost a genre in and of itself. And then next, we have historical novels that are not historically accurate, that whether because the authors didn't do the research or chose not to do the research, there's just stuff that doesn't work. We have anachronisms, we have technology appearing before it should, we have situations happening that would have never happened in that historical time period. Moving up the ladder, we have historical fiction where the author's done their research. Maybe they visited the area they wrote about. Maybe they're detailing this minor event that you've never heard of, and while you're reading the book, you stop and Google it because you're interested to learn more. Where it's an enjoyable reading experience, and as a result, you want to learn more about the things mentioned in the book. And then up at the top, we have historical fiction unlike any other historical fiction. And this is really where your mileage may vary, especially for me. On the one hand, there's the Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brian, 20 books set during the Napoleonic Wars, where you really need to look up pictures of rigging and what the ships looked like, but at the same time, it's so enjoyable to read. You go on such a journey along the way. You visit locations you've never heard about before, and the characters really grow and progress. And while there's a lot of references, there's not so many that pull you out of the story. And then there's what I like to call the Dorothy Dunnett level of historical fiction. Now look, over 10 years ago, I got sucked into the Dorothy Dunnett level of historical fiction. I have done my time, but those books are so dense where every time a character opens his mouth, it's a reference to some obscure medieval poetry in Middle French, and you need 2 reference books just to look up all these references. And the books open with lists of characters, dramatis personae, that go on for 10 pages, and it's a mix of fictional characters and real characters, and there's just, you spend a lot of time in it, you get sucked in, but at the same time, there's almost too much going on. And I think for me, within Star Wars, your mileage may vary level is sort of around the Luceno level of Star Wars knowledge, where you're not just here for a good story, you're here because you want all those references and callbacks. What I found was because there's so much talking and callbacks and references that the story felt slow to me. And I think, too, the time jumps are also at play here. That as the novel opens, we don't see Plagueis' training. We see Plagueis at the moment where he kills his master and takes the reins as the sole Sith in the galaxy. And then he runs around killing other potential Sith, politically scheming, discovering Sidious, turning Sidious to his side. And then there's another time jump, and we're 11 years later, and we've bypassed almost all of Sidious's training, so that while he's still Plagueis' apprentice, they are on much more even footing now. And we return to more political scheming as Plagueis tries to get Palpatine into power. And there's definitely fight scenes, there's action scenes intermixed in there, but if you're not a fan of all the political stuff in the prequels, you might have some difficulties with Plagueis because so much of it is politics, and the guilds, and the groups, and the corporations, and the corruption, and the bureaucracy. I think, too, for me, the lead up to the events at the end of the second part, Apprentice to Power, were the most interesting because they were things that we had never really heard about or learned in previous books. We have the senator from Malastare turning on Plagueis, the assassination attempt, Sidious going and killing everyone there. It's interesting and exciting. And then with the last time jump, we jump forward 20 years. And it's seeing behind the scenes of those plots that played out in the prequel era novels like Cloak of Deception and Darth Maul Shadowhunter. But at the same time, I've read those books. I read them this year, so I read them recently. I know what happens in them. So it was more seeing how Plagueis and Palpatine have maneuvered these things in place, but how events still go beyond their control despite everything that they've planned. I would say, too, that for a novel called Darth Plagueis, this is almost more Palpatine's origin story than truly the story of Plagueis. Because, as I said, we start when he kills his master. We get his backstory told through the following chapters. But mainly this story is about the rise of Palpatine, how he rose above his family to become something greater. I mean, something very, very evil, but something more than even his father could have accomplished. And I think part of that is because a key element of Plagueis' character is that he wants to conquer death. He wants to live forever. The book mentions it in the blurb, but how that plays out in the story is that we don't get a lot of details there. What we learn is that he manipulates midichlorian to question mark? I mean, that's basically it. That's all we get. He finally reaches a point where he's able to heal himself. He's constantly meddling and he has all these experiments, but we don't really see any of the experiments other than Venomous, the Bith apprentice of his master who is sent to kill him, and he has him like on life support the whole time as he and his droid experiment on him. And he conquers death. He's able to kill him and bring him back, and kill him and bring him back, and kill him and bring him back, and kill him and bring him back. But Luceno doesn't go into any detail here, and I do understand why, because this is honestly so esoteric. How would you describe this? Like, it was surprising to me that the book sells itself as being about Plagueis' search for immortality when it felt like that really wasn't as much of the book as was promised. And part of that may have been just what happened as Luceno got to work on it a second time after it was canceled for the first time, that while initially he had wanted that storyline of Qui-Gon Jinn and Plagueis, on the search for knowledge about immortality, that in getting to write it a second time, either he decided or Lucas Books and Del Rey decided that it was more important to focus on Palpatine here to give us, yes, his origin story, how he rose to greatness, and what his thinking was like every step of the way. I did find it surprising, though, that Plagueis and Palpatine are working towards this goal of destroying the Jedi Order and taking over the galaxy, and that this is something that the rule of two Sith since Bane onwards have been slowly working towards. But I guess I had always gotten the sense that Palpatine must have had visions of the future that would let him work this out so well, and honestly, no, he doesn't. Plagueis doesn't. They're pushing the galaxy towards a breaking point, but they don't have any concrete vision of what they're trying to accomplish. It's a fair bit of fumbling in the dark. I mean, they're proficient at what they do, but they're just sort of destabilizing things, hoping it will reach a point where things just go completely to hell. One of the potential Sith that Plagueis eliminates in the first part of the book is a woman who did have a vision of the Clone Wars, but she's killed. And so part of the story involves Plagueis knowing that they'll need war to break out and they'll need some sort of force to turn on the Jedi, and how do you achieve that force? And almost him and Palpatine brainstorming it, like, well, it need to be someone they trust, and Plagueis is trying to clone these aliens because they are force resistant like Hutts or Toydarians are, and it doesn't work right. So I guess that's another thing, where the story ends during the Phantom Menace. We don't see the culmination of any of the things that will lead into the Clone Wars. We see Dooku leave the Jedi Order, but he doesn't yet know that Palpatine's a Sith. We see Master Sifo-Dyas push towards contacting Kamino about an army, but he hasn't done that yet. And we see the Trade Federation and the groups like that the Sith are allied with starting to build up forces. But again, it surprised me because I thought that from my understanding of the Clone Wars that Palpatine had a more concrete image of what would happen. But instead, it seems like that was very much not the case, that one of his force abilities was not precognition or visions of the future, that his talents lay more in his charisma and his political abilities. And I guess, too, it is very interesting to me that the Sith could be these hugely prominent people in the galaxy, that Plagueis' master was this genius, ship builder and designer, that Plagueis is not a member of the intergalactic banking clan, but very closely linked to them, and that Sidious ultimately becomes the supreme chancellor of the galaxy, and no one picks up on this. But I guess that's the point, that with all the work the Sith have done to make things murky and cloudy, that the Jedi are completely blind to things that are going on around them. I did appreciate getting to see Dooku and Sifo-Dyas here, though, because Sifo-Dyas was always just a name. But then in the Clone Wars TV show, we finally saw Sifo-Dyas, so here we see him that, like Dooku, he is worried about the state of the Republic, and he is suggestible enough that Plagueis is able to push him towards ordering that army, knowing full well that the Sith will use that to their own benefit. And Dooku, too, seeing how frustrated he is with the corruption within the Republic, but at the same time, how open he is to the dark side and to things that the Jedi are not willing to do, that it doesn't take very much prompting on the part of Palpatine to push him towards the path he takes. that, like Joruus C'baoth, Dooku thinks very highly of himself and his abilities, and that's part of his downfall. Two of Palpatine's key advisors, Pestage and Doriana, also appear in this book, although I'm not sure how having Doriana here fits with the timeline, because he seemed like a young man in Outbound Flight, which was set 5 years before Attack of the Clones, but here it's like 50 years before the Battle of Yavin, and he's a young man, and that would mean he's still a young man over 20 years later. It was one bit where the timeline didn't quite sync up for me. We get to see Maul a little bit, not in any great detail. It's basically Sidious finds Maul, and then Sidious hands him off for training, and then we see him around the time of the Phantom Menace, and Maul almost thinks too highly of himself, that the reason that he's able to be defeated is because he's been led to believe that he's the best there is. He can't be beaten. That Maul, beyond anything else, wants to kill a Jedi Master, and that's his downfall in the end, that he can't think beyond that. He's not an equal to Palpatine, he's just a tool that's been constructed. And I think the almost rivalry or the difference between Plagueis and Palpatine here is interesting, because Plagueis is working towards this goal of the Sith having control of everything, and he's doing all these things to achieve that goal, but it seems like he doesn't really have any concrete ideas of how he's going to keep that power. It's almost like in being so focused on immortality, like the details, especially later on the story, just fall away from him. And it's really Palpatine, the one who does the dirty work to get everything into play, who has an idea of, once I achieve power, this is what I will do, which makes Plagueis' belief that Palpatine will make him co-chancellor with him naive and sad, because it's like, buddy, you didn't put in half the hard work that your apprentice did, and you really think you're gonna reap the results for that? So I touched on it a little, but let's go into my issues with Plagueis. First of all, I do have to add again that if you are preparing for your SATs and you need to make sure you have a full repertoire of big boy words, you can do no better than checking out a James Luceno novel. As I was reading Darth Plagueis, every time I got a word that just struck me as like, oh, that's a $100 word, that is some heavy thesaurus searching, I wrote it down. So please enjoy a list of all the big thesaurus words that I noted in Darth Plagueis. I noted over 20 of them. There were probably even more, but those were just the ones where I was like, I'm gonna look that up. Second, I will just say, again, because of the time jumps, I felt like there were elements here that I was really interested in that just got pushed to backstory or never even covered. Most of Palpatine's training as a Sith is consigned to that time jump period, because by the time we jump 11 years later, he's done most of his training, and now we just get to see a few instances of him and Plagueis being Sith together, but then we head back to the politics stuff. Or that 20-year time jump from part 2 to part 3. By the time we get to part 3, Palpatine is a career politician, but we haven't seen really most of the stuff he does while in power. We hear that he's, walking a tightrope between appealing to this group and appealing to this group, but, he never actually does anything big. That the crisis on Naboo is the thing that really catapults him to power. And I don't know if that is a symptom of this being like historical fiction, but it did feel like we just glossed over a lot of events here. We heard about them in passing, or they were confined to that time jump and we move forward, with the result that there is a lot of politics here. And again, if you're not a big fan of all the politics in the prequels, you may not enjoy this book very much. And I think, too, the decision to have the third part of the book set in the lead up to the Battle of Naboo meant that it covered a lot of familiar ground, almost retread. Yes, we're seeing those events from a different viewpoint, that we hadn't seen from those stories, but it's stuff I already know that readers reading this may already know. And if you haven't read those stories, it really spoils the ending of most of those tales, that you end up knowing the conclusion of everything that happens in Cloak of Deception, what all that scheming leads to. You know the fate of Lorne when he thought that he had gotten out. You know what happens to Dorvala and the miners. So while it's interesting to see, say, Palpatine maneuver Padme's parents into accepting her running for queen, it's stuff we already know. And finally, third, I just felt like this book was very heavy on talking, especially the philosophy stuff, and I would have maybe liked a little more action at times. I felt like when we did get action, like the assassination attempt, it was really interesting, and I thought Luceno did a good job. But there's just so much talking in the in-between bits, and that's especially why I categorize this as a historical novel within the Star Wars universe, because it's not pew 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 and starfighters and all that. It's philosophy and politics and scheming and nudging people towards outcomes that they want, which is not always the most exciting to read. So, in short, Darth Plagueis is almost the culmination of all the prequel era novels. Luceno really connects the dots between characters and situations. It is interesting to see Palpatine's rise to power, but at the same time, I felt like he almost overshadowed Plagueis, the character who you would think the novel is most about. It seemed like as Palpatine gained in power, Plagueis took a increasingly backseat to the narrative. And I think Darth Plagueis really is your mileage may vary territory here. If you like Sith philosophy and politics and really dense, obscure references, you're going to love it. But if you're wanting a little more action, a little less sentences and sentences and sentences and sentences of this is why the Sith do this and we do this and blah 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 blah, you might start to get a little bored with some of the sections here. I especially found the third part hard going just because it covers a lot of ground we've already covered with those novels that lead up to the Phantom Menace. Still, I'm glad that I finally read Darth Plagueis, that at the end of this prequels reread, I finally got to visit a novel that I had heard so much about. So next time, I'm going to jump a little back to a number of short stories about the Clone Wars that came out between 2002 and 2005, most of them in the Star Wars Insider magazine. I'm titling it Tales of the Clone Wars.